Ways of framing this. I have three ways of kind of framing what I view as some of the critical challenges in dissemination, all of which are pretty unpopular. So if you don't like me at the end of this, I'm sorry, but I do understand. Um, Most of what we focus on in the health IT standards communities are some combination of the top three boxes. So standards data or semantic data interoperability, things like terminology and value sets and isosemantic transforms. Um, uh, a lot of work we put into this particular area to making sure that data is portable, transformable, compatible in mutual directions. Wire protocol compatibility, I put like fire and more like electrical socket into or electrical plug into electrical socket level compatibility, where like the envelopes that we're exchanging between institutions are fundamentally compatible with each other. So not really semantics, but really just kind of at a lower level almost. Fire is in, debatably V2 is very much in that category as well. And lastly, you have DSLs, domain specific languages. Prime example would be like CQL, where it's very purpose specific. It was developed, to work with fire specifically. It's clearly, specialized for like the medical domain as well. So when we take all three of these, a lot of the artifacts we produce are like very focused in these areas, and that's great, except that from an adopter standpoint of CDS specifically and CBK more generally, that there's this like cornucopia of practical issues that prevent people from using your work, even if it's the best thing since sliced bread. And that can be like warranty issues, like whether, or excuse me, it can be everything from like who's liable for its use, like is there someone to support it? How do you handle like jurisdictional differences between the state of Arizona where I am and DC? How do you measure if it's being used, let alone being affected? Like if there's a commercial aspect to it, like how does that come into play? I mean, there's so many areas that are completely critical non-starters to adopters of CBK that we aren't really interesting to us, and especially from an academic perspective. The second way I think of like one of the fundamental problems, and especially in the VA case, is that we, including myself, like tend to gravitate towards more like academic means of publishing software. And so the model that we've all all familiar with, and as we were prepping our AMIA papers, due next month, of getting funding, building, doing our experimentation, putting in the research, and then kind of like associating the release of any like level 3 or level 4 asset with the actual publication of a manuscript. And what that does mentally to me is it creates kind of this like throw it over the wall type mentality that once you publish that manuscript, you're kind of released to focus on the next big thing and do one of the most important parts of publishing, which is to leave through the nearest door with the biggest pile of money behind it. And if there's not to say that we don't care about what happens on the other side of the wall, but we kind of lack the incentives a lot of times to maintain the thing that we just published. And unfortunately, that leads to an attitude of what we call implementation issues that are not our problem. And if someone has an issue with one of the VHA artifacts of actually trying to adopt it, that program ended. There's no one to support it. You're kind of on your own. And the way that I propose that like the broader CBK community think of publication, and especially of level 4 artifacts, it involves all the same steps, but in a bit of a different order that are supported by the marketplace standard. So we still need to build things and fund things, but we really should be focusing on the publication of warrantable turnkey CBK assets as quickly as possible. And that allows us to very rapidly enter into that feedback loop. You can call it a learning health system or agile development, call it whatever you will. But that cycle is absolutely critical, both to developing a better asset that people actually are asking for and solving real problems, as well as providing a vested interest for the people that are adopting them, because they know that there's somebody that's actually listening and building something rather than just kind of developing in a local vacuum that's only been tested at one hospital and kind of throwing it out to the world. The third way I think about it is, oh, excuse me. And then there's like a fourth step too, where we tend to not really consider commercial needs as well. And I don't have time to go into this, but there are a lot of financial reasons why people don't adopt things. I mean, and very often it's the case where people would rather pay for some support just to know that there's like some sort of warranty, there's someone to call to be able to use a CDS asset in practice. I mean, it's a hard argument to ask a hospital to adopt something when there's no support behind it. And the third reason I like this model better is that the whole L1, L4 thing is really useful for these sorts of discussions. But when it comes to the adopter community, there is a grand canyon of difference in ROI across the different categories. And from my perspective, when it comes to like our own investments in producing CBK, we should be obsessing about L4, especially from the economic standpoint, that it has orders of magnitudes better scalability qualities than any of the other categories. And while narratives, for example, if you have a good narrative and you have an executable version of that, you can typically generate a lot of stuff in the middle, even if you even have a requirement to do that. And so without like beating a dead horse, I think there's a lot of reasons why we need to kind of like tweak the model of publication. I'm going to try to go for about 7 more minutes here. So it's just an example of a real use case. This is Dr. Delagrando at Arizona State University. She's an associate professor under an NIH R01 grant that I also work on through 2028. You know, good for her. And she's developing a real world set of CDS assets. One is a CDX hook service, which is box number 3 here. And there's boxes 4, 5, and 6, which are also hers, but depend on box number 3. And box number 3 also depends on boxes 2 and 1, which are underlying third-party dependencies of HappyFire and so on. And so it's very level 4, and it's very real world, in that it's not this single isolated thing that someone can just download and run. There's a lot of pre-coordination, especially within these bottom areas of like integration and endpoints, and how does fire access control work, and a myriad of details that are going to prevent people from using her research if she just puts it out on GitHub. And so the demo portion of this, just to kind of quickly shift over to the solution side, what I suggest is that in the spirit of going into more of this like agile release process, and establishing this feedback loop with real people outside of her, Arizona, Colorado stakeholder network, to start by taking each of those yellow boxes and first of all submitting them to a centralized system with metadata that, I mean, if you use the CDS connector repository before, kind of similar in spirit to the way that works. However, with a difference in scope, that internally now we're not just modeling metadata for purposes of findability, which is kind of this box in the lower left here, but we're also modeling configuration parameters for adopting it. So finding it is one thing, but actually using it is another. And this part here on the lower right-hand side gets very technical. We won't get into that, but it is kind of the secret sauce that I feel that is required to bridge the gap and to allow particularly health systems to do things like try 10 different CBK assets within the course of a 30-day period against synthetic data, and then make their own decisions. Do they want to continue pursuing this or not? Or maybe they're close and they're kind of close, but there's some like quality issues and they need to go back to the author of the CBK and work with them in that feedback loop. But all of that is predicated on modeling the runtime adoptability aspects as well as the findability parts as well. I'm just going to comment briefly on the licensing aspects as well. I spent a lot of time thinking about the ways to reconcile differences between the way the government and academia publishes CBK as well as the commercial space licenses CBK. There's a whole like sub demo that goes into how academic publication works in just typical open source manner. That's all fine, but also supporting the idea of like time constrained licensing and licenses that have some sort of usage or metered utility charge associated with it. And that my argument to academia to consider this is because having that sticky financial incentive is very motivating to people to keep maintaining something that they've published. And whereas if you just design that out completely, you're really limiting the potential sustainability qualities of the ecosystem because you're forcing people to go outside of the ecosystem to fund themselves. Publication in this HL7 deployment, excuse me, is going to produce a gallery very similar to like Smart on Fire galleries, app stores, and so on. But one of the biggest differences to the adopters is that it will have like these big green buttons that you can actually download and run the asset yourself on your computer, or if you have a cloud environment, to be able to deploy that in an actual automated manner. And you don't necessarily need to have like you're not required to have an informatics team to be able to look at the XML files and have some sort of runtime and do all the EHR integration. Whereas if all you want to do is see it running against some synthetic data and then just kind of take it from there, we're trying to make that as turnkey as possible. So while keeping an eye on time here, the timeline, at least for the HL7 instance of this, is around May for some of the features, and then things like the automated turnkey distribution and deployment aspects are going to be coming in the future. Some actionable items for MCBK, and I would love to engage more with certain HHS agencies as well as communities like MCBK to figure out how to create more of a community-driven governance mechanism, and particularly around the curation of artifacts and their sustainability, less so in the actual development of individual assets, but to have a governance structure that will scale, for the next 20 plus years, and to produce an immediately useful, like full automation first delivery vehicle for CBK of all standards. That's probably a good stopping point.
Thank you so much, Preston. Well, we have time available. I would say one, maybe two questions for Preston that we could field, and then hand over to Arlene. If we have any time towards the end, we can ask questions of both presenters. Any questions for Preston at this time?
Preston, I just say that it's very interesting presentation. It'd be fun to kind of play in that sandbox a little bit. There's sort of a demo space for that, or how could you kind of take a look at kicking the tires?
Yeah, so there's going to be later this year. So like the formal plan for the rollout for the HL7 version hasn't even really been announced formally. It's just in the process of being rolled out. And there's going to be policies as well for the way that RI developers actually publish their guides. And so it'll be a step in the probably prior to balloting, where you're going to publish that asset into the system, and so that people can actually both find it and use it. So that guidance is, not to like punt too far, like Josh was saying, but probably around May or June.
Thanks, Bruce. Ed, do you have a question?
Sure. Yeah. Hey, Preston. So, good question. Who do you see as like the first set of adopters of such a service? So, would it be agency? I guess in general, let's say CBK developers, originators, say CDS developers. But if you had to pick one set of early adopters, would they be HHS agencies? Would it be like the VA? Would it be like EHR vendors?
The short answer is like in the domain aspect. So I am targeting like CDS or FHIR-backed CDS first, but then the agencies most definitely. So that's at the top of my list, but in a different capacity. So like I think VHA for this case would be like a potentially better consumer than a publisher. So to ask like the broader MCBK community to publish through this or another deployment of the system for purposes of allowing or enabling the government to adopt best practices that are captured in level 4 assets. And then for, like HRQ, for example, supporting it for more publication, so more on the supply side. So I kind of have a different answer to that depending on what the agency is, but The short answer is yeah, absolutely.
Got it. No, that helps. Thanks.
Thanks so much. And if we have time at the end of the session, we can certainly open it up to both Preston and Arlene. But with that, let's pivot over to Arlene Bierman, who is going to be presenting or demoing rather on interoperable EHR data for comprehensive care planning, evidence generation, implementation among people living with multiple chronic conditions. And my apologies, I also neglected to mention Dave Carlson, also on the call and on the slide here. And so Arlene and Dave, welcome. And the floor is yours.
Yeah, so the why, what we're doing and how it fits into the, MCBK universe. And then Dave is gonna demo it. I'm gonna go through my slides really, really quickly so that we have more time for the demo. But certainly there's, we could ask questions afterwards. And I just want to first acknowledge it. This is a big team that's put this together, and we're really excited how far we've come with our eCare plan, which is basically a Smart on Fire app. And sort of the use case, what we're doing is we're doing this for multiple chronic conditions, and multiple chronic conditions are really the elephant in the room. It's the most common chronic condition seen in clinical practice. 1 in 3 adults overall, and 4 in 5 people in Medicare, people over 65. And the problem is that we have, a disease specific for guidelines too, rather than person-centered approach. And a lot of our evidence doesn't support, whole person-centered care planning that also takes into account, multiple diseases, social context, goals, etc. And there's really many interoperability obstacles in delivering coordinated care and integrated care for these people, and the data do not easily move across settings of care. And it's also, I have to, mention that it's a health equity issue because people from low-income backgrounds and underrepresented racial or ethnic groups develop multiple chronic conditions at higher rates in earlier ages. So, if we look at the standard, cycle between evidence synthesis, implementation, and generation, one of the challenges with guidelines for people for multiple chronic conditions is all of our evidence is real. Most of it is disease-based. And as a matter of fact, most people with multiple comorbidities are excluded from clinical trials. So we really don't have evidence on them. And we also don't have evidence on how to best manage combinations of conditions, with a few exceptions. And so we do, implement, evidence in practice. But I think the real opportunity here is to generate comprehensive real-world evidence on people with multiple conditions, so we have the data to actually generate the needed evidence. And this schematic just shows the way it is now. Somebody who has multiple conditions sees multiple doctors, and very, if they're not in an integrated health system, their data is all over the place. And our vision is to have, a central patient data that can be accessed by all, including the patient. So we have 2 complementary apps. One is clinician facing, and the other one is, and for not only just for the clinician, but for the whole interdisciplinary healthcare team, if there is one. And also the other one is patient and caregiver facing. So this was our goal. We're actually funded by ASPE. And our goal is to build capacity for pragmatic patient-centered outcomes research by developing an interoperable electronic care plan to facilitate aggregation and data sharing across home, community, clinic, and research-based settings. And I'm not going to go through how we've solved these issues in our eCare plan apps, but just to say what a shared care, and this definition actually was developed by ONC, but a comprehensive shared care plan gives the person direct access to their health data, puts the person's goals at the center of decision-making. It includes in clinical and non-clinical data, and it follows the person across their care, journeys. And it also allows for care team coordination. And the idea behind this is it's a tool that can improve clinical management, care delivery. But if you collect all this data in the real world, then you also have it for research and for developing, evidence. We had 3 deliverables. We have the data elements, value sets, and FHIR mappings. We have our HL7 FHIR implementation guide, which will be published this spring. And we are in the process using an agile design process of testing the clinician-facing and patient caregiver-facing apps. So these are the domains included in our care plan, person and plan, health concerns, goals, interventions, and outcomes. And I'm not going to spend time on this because Dave is going to show those to you. And so the real goal is we can then access more complete, comprehensive real-world data for research. So the data is complete because it aggregates from multiple EHRs across multiple settings of care, so it reduces the missingness of data. It's comprehensive. It includes all relevant disease and symptom states, and it's inclusive of clinical and contextual data, including health-related social needs, social determinants of health data. And it's real world that includes people with multiple chronic conditions who are excluded from most studies, and it's representative of day-to-day lives. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to Dave.
Thank you, Arlene. I'll pick up on sharing my screen. Is this all visible now to everyone? So a few slides, real quickly touch on these for context, and then I'll want to devote most of the time to a live demo. These slides were also delivered to the conference organizers so that participants can receive this afterward, including some screenshots of the demo. But really quickly, so Arlene talked about collecting information from a patient across multiple providers. Our best means to access this right now is via the 21st Century Cures Act. This really requires by law all patients to have the right of access via FHIR API from all the providers of certified EHR systems. So that's a core means for us to access these data. We then use these to create a comprehensive care plan within this SMITR and FHIR application, also enabling patients and caregivers to contribute into the shared care plan by contributing patient-authored goals, health concerns, patient-reported outcomes and other activities via FHIR questionnaires. Then looking at the FHIR implementation guide Arlene mentioned, again, touched really quickly that this provides definition of especially the clinical domains, the data elements, and then FHIR profiles for using them. Within this implementation guide, there are more than 550 values that's defined. So these define clinical concepts. All the term, there were 5-6 years worth of work from the technical expert panels that Arlene mentioned. That these are all published as part of this implementation guide. I'll show you this all in practice, executed within the application in a few minutes. Quickly touch on the architecture of the application from using the Cures Act. A patient or caregiver using the application has the right of access to all of their care providers. However, it's read-only at this point in time for the most part. Very limited, if any, write access. So we also created what we call a supplemental data store that allows the users of our application to record patient or caregiver expressed goals, health concerns, and then questionnaire responses. Again, I'll go through this in a live demo. You can see that I'll talk about a couple of core areas there. Assessments by patient and caregivers by presenting of our questionnaire. I'll show these all in the live demo. Also, from the conditions or health concerns that are retrieved from the FHIR API, we are using clinical quality language, or CQL, with the value sets from the implementation guide. And this allows us to classify or group all the conditions. We also apply the same approach to labs on other areas of the patient data. So we're tying this into the computable knowledge. So the value sets, the domain knowledge associated with those clinical concepts provide the basis then for potentially a clinical decision support. So also show you not a core part of our project, but tying to another ARC project from prior work of preventive guidelines from the USP STF. So again, a clinical quality language, CQL expression, but this is able to execute entirely within a patient-facing app using the value sets and the data that the patient read from their own data sources. So this all provides the execution and delivery of the clinical knowledge. And then finally talk about goal-oriented care planning, which is the really important element that we're focused on here. So I'm going to transition now into a live demo. So the application, we have two applications that Arlene mentioned. One is a patient caregiver facing, another is clinician facing. I'll focus this demo entirely on the patient caregiver facing app. This is a web-based application. runs in any modern web browser. I'm running it in a Safari desktop browser right now, but we also routinely test using on mobile devices, on Android, iOS devices. The same application runs across all these platforms within the web browser. It's a JavaScript-based application. The clinical query language CQL is executed entirely within the application. So a quick pass around, to save time in the demo, I've already logged into, in this case, 3 different providers. Now from our demo sites, it's difficult to create 3 different sites with different fragments of a realistic patient's data. So in fact, it's different individuals in this case, but for the purpose of in use, one individual will log into their providers. It might be at an Epic system at Oregon Health Science University, it might be plus the VA, plus a NextGen. Those are in fact the 3 providers that we're targeting as part of our pilot environment. So the patient would log into multiple providers. Then for the care plan tab within this, the core elements of the care plan are the patient's goals, health concerns, medications, other activity or interventions. And so we provide these all across the multiple providers, aggregated, and I'll show you in a few moments on how we're using the value sets then to classify or organize these. Also, another tab within this of the health status, same across all the providers where the patient has logged in, lab results, vital signs, immunizations, and then also a care team, reading the care team resource, looking at all the members of their care team. So let me go back to the health concerns to start there. So we have more than 200 value sets in our implementation guide. So the value sets include both SNOMED and ICD-10 codes. So we take all of the conditions, problemless conditions from a patient, we apply the value sets in a CQL execution logic to classify a group. So we're able to take, for example, so this is some data that came from actually a VA sandbox. It's a synthetic generated data, but in looking at the way a condition would be just raw information from the FHIR resource would be the display name of the condition. We use this condition, we use our value sets to classify it into cardiovascular disease. So we're able to group all cardiovascular disease conditions. This also means we're still a work in progress right now. Once we put this into our pilot production with live patient engagement, we'll use this as a means to take condition diagnoses across 2 or 3 different providers and group those based on these value sets to say that group all the cardiovascular disease. They might be slightly different codes or diagnoses from a clinic in Arizona versus their primary care and nephrologist in Portland. So we're able to look at these different care environments, use the value sets and the knowledge to group them. Same across all the other conditions of cardiovascular disease, chronic kidney disease. We also use the terminology within this. So for example, for CKD, a learn more link takes the code from the net, links directly to Medline Plus, and to give a patient a more patient-friendly description and understanding of their data. So this is the first aspect of applying the vast amount of work on the terminology value sets. Then looking at quickly into goals and health concerns. This is where we start interrelating the elements from the care plan. So we have a goal. So I'll look at one example here. This is in our test sandbox of our data. These are all FHIR R4 goal resources. So we have a goal, for example, to stabilize A1C. We know that this was created by a Dr. John Carlson. What date, the due date. The goal within the goal, this is all from the FHIR resource, has a target of 7%. Then we're able to use the link code from this FHIR resource of the goal, look across all of the observations we've also read from this patient across multiple providers, find the most recent A1C result. And these data are a bit dated in terms of time frame from when we created these samples. But you can see in this case, the most recent A1C was 8.2%, a goal of 7%. Also within the goal resource can indicate from the what conditions or health concerns does this goal address? So we're starting to put this map together in the graph of these relationships. So I bring this up, especially discussion from the computable knowledge perspective. Once we have these raw elements of the value sets that allow us to classify and organize the data, we have the terminology related to the goals and the target values. We're able to find the most recent values. And now we're in a position to start incorporating within this app. We see the app as being a platform for delivering clinical knowledge, computable knowledge in a patient-facing environment to directly support patient and caregivers in better understanding and making choices. So in this case, having these relationships, we can now start developing across these multiple chronic conditions, guidance to highlight, for example, the goals that are not being met, or perhaps an individual that has an A1C of 8, but they don't have any goals related to A1C. We can flag knowledge associated with that and start highlighting perhaps goals that should be created to begin stepping an individual toward managing that. The last thing I want to touch on here from the especially computable knowledge perspective is in preventive care guidelines. Before I touch that, just quickly on the collecting patient-reported outcomes and other assessments. We use the FHIR questionnaire resource presented within the app. We have 3 examples here we use, but any other resources can be incorporated. So this is the FHIR questionnaire resource for Promise 29. So there are 29 elements categorized in 7 different areas. So this is all a FHIR questionnaire resource. The individual can step through these 7 different domains from the Promise 29, respond to these questions, and then the results are submitted directly to our supplemental data server. Now we're starting to collect assessments and patient-reported information into both to support the research as well as to support additional supporting guidelines, application of guidelines for this patient. We also have another example of Prepare, which is a common SDOH instrument, as well as another questionnaire for caregiver strain specifically targeted toward our caregivers. So now touching the last element I want to address really is the preventive care guidelines. So we have now, for this individual logged into the application, they've been able to gather their conditions, goals, lab results, vital signs, care team members, and now we're able to start applying computable guidelines within this application in a patient-facing patient engagement. So in this case, the scenario is that, say, a month before an encounter with their care provider, the patient is able to, within the application, executing the CQL representation of preventive care guidelines. So these are developed as part of another ARC ACTS project about 3 years ago. So in this case, we're taking the data, using the same value sets to classify and answer questions like, does this patient have active diabetes? What is the patient's most recent PSA lab result for a prostate cancer screening? Does this patient have a prior colonoscopy procedure? We use the value sets within this application to answer all those data type questions and then apply those to the guidelines. So in this case, based on this individual's demographics and their data, it's determined that they are within the age range where a colonoscopy is recommended, and B, there is no prior record of a colonoscopy, so it can step them through some patient education to better understand when and how they might, what their choices may be, so when they reach their next provider encounter, they know that there's something that they should discuss, and that they also have some opportunity for to better for education and background on what their choices are. Another example is lung cancer screening. In this case specifically, this patient, as example, was created with a history of smoking, and also in their FHIR data, their PAC history of smoking. We're able to use that and apply it to the USP/STF guideline for lung cancer screening for individuals who have. This is a summary of what the decision is, what their recommendation is, and then step them through additional educational content, so they can better understand that this is something that may be applicable to them and that would be helpful for them to discuss in the next encounter. So there's a fast whirlwind. I want to touch on what we're doing this project. I'm going to transition back now to the slides, and there are also screenshots of what I've talked through in the application that these should be available to you afterward. But then we'll transition back to this point to Arlene to touch on some conclusions.
Yeah, so we're in the process of pilot testing the second iteration of the app at a OHSU. And we're testing it both with clinicians, patients, caregivers, and dyads between clinicians and patients. And I won't go into details because, Dave already said that we've, connected it to these EHRs. So the next slide, I want time for one question maybe. And I want to thank all of our partners who have contributed to this. And I think that's why we've been able to come this far. We've built on the work of a lot of other people, as well as our sister agencies. So, it's been great to be able to share this with you.
Arlene and Dave, thank you so much for the great presentation. We have time for one question indeed. Anyone have a question that you'd like to ask?
Hi, I can't resist. Thank you. This is wonderful work, and I'm delighted to see it, David and Arlene. But there's a piece of this missing for me, and that is, where does the plan come from in a way that reflects the original purpose of the multiple chronic conditions? The secret issue here, or the key issue here, seems to be the interactions between those chronic conditions, and are those interactions modeled in some way so that the care plan reflects those interactions? It would seem to be a wonderful opportunity for computable knowledge of a very sophisticated sort. I'm missing that piece of it.
Yeah, so Chuck, we've done a lot of the foundational work. There's a lot of opportunity to build on this. The way it works now in terms of developing a care plan, first of all, it's, this is different from a lot of other, products in that it's really patient-centered. We use a user-centered design for both the clinicians and the patients. And the way, clinicians work now, if you have, diabetes and rheumatoid arthritis and depression, is you have to look at each, and there are growing number of clinical practice guidelines that look at some, combinations of but there really isn't much there. And certainly the current guidance, is from the professional societies that you have to look at each one and weigh it. But what this does, I think it does two things. It makes it easier to put together everything's going on so you could make those decisions. Actually, three things. It puts together the patient goals with the clinician goals so you could get on the same page. And it also has, it generates, it's going to collect all this data so we could do the kind of studies that you're talking about, which you can't do now because there's so much missing data on these patients. So you could really track them and use this as a research tool to generate the evidence. So that cycle that you developed, I think this can help with that.
Thank you. I know, Josh, you want to get back, take us all back home for the closing of the meeting, but this is just so fascinating, and we could talk about this for the next 2 hours. Having said that, thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks, Preston. Thanks, Arlene. Indeed, I want to pivot back to the main room. I'm surprised we haven't been kicked out of this room yet. So my heartfelt thanks to you for taking the time to put together these fantastic presentations and sharing the great work that you're doing. More to come for sure, I'm certain. All right, see you back in the main room.
to the main room.